The second thing that can happen to us, or will happen to us when we make Jesus number one in our lives, is we'll amaze people. People will absolutely be amazed. Look at verses 11 through 13. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the form of men." And they started to call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the main speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town, brought oxen and garlands to the gates. He, with the crowds, intended to offer sacrifice. There in Lystra, there was a legend that said Zeus and Hermes had appeared in human form in that region before. The Lystran people were simple. They were very superstitious. And when these guys showed up and performed this miracle, they believed that Zeus and Hermes had shown back up. They were a polytheistic people. They thought there were multiple gods. And so that's what's going on here. That's why they started praising and worshiping Barnabas and Paul. And it makes sense. They were simple folks who'd never seen anything like that before. They were amazed by what they had seen. When we make Jesus number one in our lives, we will amaze people by what they see in us. When we love differently, when we mourn differently, when we forgive differently, when people see the fruit of the Spirit in us, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, the things that the world just does not seem to possess, people will be amazed by that. They'll want to know what's different. Now, she'd kill me if I told you this, but Kathleen, since she's not in here, I'll do it. Kathleen is one of these people who absolutely amaze me. We all know people who amaze us by their spirit, by their devotion to the Lord, by the way they live differently. And Kathleen is one of those people to me. I'll give you the rundown of her week here. Last Saturday, she had the backyard Bible club at our house. There were 17 kids. That would put me down for a week. I don't do well with kids, but that's okay. Then Sunday she came and had a little bit of time off here at church, but then on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday she worked over 40 hours because Thursday, Friday, and Saturday we were going to West Virginia to be with her family in the mountains. So we get back at midnight last night, right? Now she's washing clothes because today she's leaving about 3 o'clock to go to camp for a week with a couple of elementary school girls. Then she'll come back, work Friday and Saturday, and she does it with a smile on her face too. That's why she amazes me, because I'd be complaining and absolutely miserable. But everything she does is a result of making the Lord first in her life. I don't tell you all this to brag on her, although I do kind of. I'm proud of her. And the reason I know this works is because I've seen it happen in her life. By making the Lord number one in her life, I know people in this very room whose lives have been impacted by that. They have been amazed at the way she's lived and have come to surrender their lives to Jesus Christ as a result. She amazes me. And when we surrender our lives to Jesus Christ and make Him number one, whether you're Paul or Barnabas or Kathleen or whoever you are, making Jesus number one in your life and then living according to the new life He gives you, you will begin to amaze people with how you live. When you begin to amaze people with how you live because you've made Jesus number one, you'll see the next thing happen. And that is, you'll begin to lead people to Christ. Look at verses 14 through 18. The apostles Barnabas and Paul tore their robes when they heard this and rushed into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are men also with the same nature as you, and we are proclaiming good news to you, that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In past generations He allowed all the nations to go their own way, although He did not leave Himself without a witness, since He did what is good by giving you rain from heaven, and fruitful seasons, and satisfying your hearts with food and happiness. If you'll turn back a couple pages to Acts chapter 12, I want you to see something. Acts chapter 12, you're going to be looking at verses 20 through 23 here. But here in these verses we just read, Paul and Barnabas, when they were being worshipped as gods, it resulted in them tearing their robes in protest. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but I mentioned before that teachers dressed a little differently than common folk. And maybe that's why they tore their robes, because they wanted to differentiate themselves or make themselves more common by ruining the robes that set them apart. John Pohill, in his commentary on Acts, says that there are a couple things that tearing your clothes would refer to in the Jewish culture. One, it could be a protest of just a protest of a blasphemy, or in response to just a great hurt, just an emotional scarring, whatever. And here these guys are protesting probably both of those things. They were hurt by what the people were doing because they were there to glorify the Lord, and now these folks thinking they were gods. And they were protesting the blasphemy. They were letting everybody know, hey, we're not gods. We're just like you. We're just people. We're just people who need to know the Lord. So back in Acts chapter 12, verse 20, this is Herod's death. And this is a drastic difference between the way Herod responded to being called a god and the way Paul and Barnabas responded to being called a god. Here in Acts 12:20, he had been very angry with the Tyrrhenians and the Sidonians. Together they presented themselves before him. They won over Blastus, who was in charge of the king's bedroom, and through him they asked for peace, because their country was supplied with food from the king's country. So on an appointed day, dressed in royal robes and seated on the throne, Herod delivered a public address to them. The assembled people began to shout, "It's the voice of a god and not of a man." At once an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give the glory to God, and he became infected with worms and died. The historian Josephus says that on that day Herod wore a robe that was not just silver, but made of silver. Herod did all he could to let people think he was a god, including dress the part. But here, back in Acts chapter 14, we see Paul and Barnabas do the exact opposite. The clothes they had on, they tattered. They tore them. They had made Jesus number one in their lives. And so they wanted to be sure that their lives pointed to Christ, because that's what they wanted to do. When we make Jesus number one in our lives, we will lead people to Christ. We can't help it. It's a function of who we are in Him as new creations. It'll be what we want to do. We'll lead people to Christ any chance we get. And when we do that, you see the next thing happen in verse 19, back in Acts 14. The next thing that happens is, when we lead people to Christ, we will get knocked down. We will get knocked down. Look at verse 19. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium when they had won over the crowds and stoned Paul. They dragged him out of the city thinking he was dead. After the disciples surrounded... Oh, I got ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, stop at 19. So a lynch mob from Iconium and Antioch comes to Lystra, trying to finish what they started. Remember, they ran Paul and Barnabas out of town. They wanted those guys gone. They didn't want them infecting anybody else preaching a Messiah that welcomed Gentiles. So they follow these guys to Lystra, and they manage to find Paul, and they stone him, apparently to death. They drag him outside the city, and we don't know what they do after that. They probably go to the tavern and celebrate the fact that they vindicated the God that didn't like Gentiles. I don't know what they did. But anyway, Paul was in bad shape, right? Paul was in bad shape. He got up, which is bizarre because they thought he was dead. That's kind of an odd thing. There are some scholars who think that Paul actually may have been killed and was resurrected to continue his work, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But when we do this, when we lead people to Christ by nature of our new life in Him, we will get knocked down.